This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening. Welcome to this edition of African Drums. As you know, African Drums is the television arm of the Cuffy 250 Committee, which is an organization devoted to and dedicated to raising African consciousness through education and self-improvement. This evening, we will continue a conversation we were having last week on the relationship between race and politics in Guyana and looking at it from a historical perspective. Last week we talked with Mr. Alexander and Mr. Norton. This evening we will continue with Mr. Alexander to expand a little bit on what we talked about. Now, last week, welcome, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you very much.
You're here alone. Last week, what we did, we broke the timeline. Since we were talking about race and politics, we broke the timeline concerning race from beginning in 1638, when Africans were brought to Guyana as slaves, and the first period was we considered was 1638 to 1838, which is a 200-year period until slavery and after the apprenticeship period. Then from 1838 we talked a little bit about what happened in the pre-independence movement, if you will, starting from the early pre-independence movement, going from 1838 to 1950s. And what we said there was that at the end of that period we had the composition, the racial composition that we pretty much have today. Whereas in the first period we had just we had Amerindians in Guyana, we had Africans who were brought brought over and enslaved, and then we had some Europeans. After 1838 we had a massive influx of East Indians who came over from India as indentured laborers, 2 or 40,000 plus. We had also the Portuguese, and we had some Chinese. So the racial composition changed significantly between the two periods. Now we go into just the early 1950s, when we had a lot of political activity. We also had isms coming into being, a lot of ideologies in communism and socialism and so forth. So in addition to an expanded racial mix, we now had a lot of ideologies that were focusing on what Guyana was doing and Guyana's politics. So Vincent, why don't you take us from there? We're in the 50s now, and we're getting into the pre-independence movement, and then we want to, by the end of this program, we want to get to now for 2 periods. So,
all right. I want to take us back very briefly to 1947, because 1947 in some regards was a watershed year. It was the year when Dr. Gunn was elected to the legislature. And what's important about that, we saw in 1947 that to enable the election of Dr. Gunn, Ng-A-Qui, the then Sydney King, played a critical role on the East Coast, where he marshaled the forces to support Dr. Gunn. And so in 1947, Dr. Gunn became one of our first persons through that route to enter the legislature. And it's clearly demonstrated the acceptance of the plural nature of the society and the need for the groups to work together, and this was exemplified by Jagan and Ng-A-Qui working to make Jagan's accession to the legislature possible in 1947. We also see that then led to the formation of the PAC in 1949. And again, the PAC represented that kind of recognition of the nature of our society and involved Dr. Jagan on one hand and people like Guyana and others.
What is PAC?
PAC, at that time I'm kind of hazy here. I'll get back to that.
Okay.
But it was the precursor to the People's Progressive Party. It was the People's Affairs Committee, Political Affairs Committee. Political Affairs Committee. Age is catching up with me. Yes, the Political Affairs Committee, which was the precursor to the People's Progressive Party, and it saw a number of people who would eventually go into the People's Progressive Party being part of that committee. Jagan himself, Janet, Hubbard, Guyana, all playing a critical role in the formation of the PAC. But again, the point we want to make is that even in that formation, there was some recognition of the ethnic nature of our society, and a definite attempt was made to bring the ethnic groups together through their leaders and through their leadership. The PAC then led to the formation of the People's Progressive Party, and by then Burnham would have returned and been party excuse me, to the formation of the People's Progressive Party. And clearly what we had emerging at that time was, in a sense, Cheddi Jagan representing the Ng-A-Guyanese in that formation, and Forbes Burnham representing the Afro-Guyanese in that formation. And one might ask, why do you establish that divide on one hand and probably that coalition on the other hand? The fact of the matter is that Cheddi did sort out an African Guyanese to join with him. And in the first instance, the idea was that Ashton Chase would be that person, but Ashton Chase declined. And based on recommendations, both local and Caribbean, I dare say, it was decided that Forbes Burnham would be such a good person. Just graduated, on his way home from the UK, and so we had the coming together of Jagan and Burnham in the People's Progressive Party, its formation. Now at that point of formation, Burnham became the chairman of the party, and Jagan its general secretary. And there was no post such as leader of the party, but one could start to see the structures reflecting some ideological inclinations, because in the East and in most of the communist countries and parties, the general secretary was de facto the leader. So though they did not identify someone called the leader, history seemed to record Jagan as being the leader. But I think the more important point we want to make is that that occurrence seemed to reflect a representation of ideological inclinations through the structures that communist parties would have taken at that time. So we now had the formation of the PPP, a party that represented all of the interests, in a sense, all of the ethnic interests at least in Guyana, but a party that also represented specifically at that time working class interests, because it was coming up against the old legislative configuration, which really represented the planter class in a sense, and those people who were pro-capitalist. So the PPP emerged now essentially as a working class leftist party on the national landscape. That party was able to, in 1953, right, at our first elections under the suffrage, to make a clean sweep, and were able to get an overwhelming majority in the parliament. I think, however, things we don't always mention should be noted. That notwithstanding the clean sweep that the party got in terms of the seats in the national legislature, if one were to look at the voter turnout, I don't think that one could argue that the voter turnout was a very impressive voter turnout. It was somewhere in the vicinity, I think, of 60 odd percentage, and nowhere in the vicinity of 80 or 90. And I think we need to observe that in retrospect, that there was a significant part of the population that did not participate in those elections, but the part that participated, the PPP overwhelmingly got those seats. The PPP obviously was led by a large number of young men. They were in their late 20s and early 30s, the Burnhams, the Jagans, the Martin Carters, the Guyanas, the Westmosses, and all of those guys, very young guys. And I think some of their inexperience became obvious very early in their leftist enthusiasm. They donned themselves in white suits and red ties as they attended the parliament and things like that, evidencing their leftism. But they were doing this at the time when they were still a colony. And I think it's important to note that even at that time there may have been trends, even though they were all leftists. They may not have been all on the same plane in terms of leftism. I think that one could say that undoubtedly Chelly Jagan was left, far left. I think Burnham was probably more moderate, and I think Chelly Jagan understood that at that time, and it's important for us to make this point as well, because by 1953 the British suspended our constitution, brought troops in and placed an interim government in place. And we've always asked the historical question, why is it with a government elected with no problems of violence in the country or anything like that, why would the British suspend the constitution? And I think the conclusion has always been that they were wrong, that they wanted to continue their domination, and that there was really no basis for suspension. But when one looks now at information which is becoming available, one could see it in the context of the Cold War, where the ongoing struggle for dominance between the East and the West, and the fact that Jagan had already in 1951 been in contact with the communists. Evidence is now there to show that he had written to the Czech communists asking for support, and in fact in that request he had clearly stated that the left wing of the party, so he himself in his mind, though not articulating it to the Guyanese population, had identified that there was a left wing as opposed to the party at large. And he had stated in those correspondence that the left wing was well in charge, and he was seeking support of the communists in the struggle for independence in the face of British colonization and in the face of imperialism. So that in a sense he had fixed his eyesights on a battle, and was determined that the left wing would be the ones who would carry the struggle. I think one should note here that probably Burnham was not of that left wing, but I'm not sure that Burnham was aware of all that Jagan was doing, because we see in 1953, after the suspension of the Constitution, both of them traveled to England, and Jagan, in response to the British press, denied any connections with the communists, except for his attendance at the festival, the Festival of Youth and Students, a festival which Burnham had also attended. And so Jagan said very bluntly to the journalists, I have no connections with the communist world, apart from having attended the conference, the festival. And he was saying that they were accompanied by Burnham, and they were therefore supposed to be at one. But we now know that probably they were not at one, because in fact Jagan in 51 had already made contact, and Burnham certainly was not the one who was pursuing that ideological line, that ideological direction. So in a sense the scene was set once the Constitution was suspended in 53, and Burnham started to make it clear that he thought there were flaws in the way in which we were propagating leftism at a time when we really needed just a struggle for independence. The scene was set for the division in the party. A division came about in eventually in 1955, which at the level of the leadership took on ideological dimensions, because one could see that though the party was built around an ideology, supposedly, and built around some kind of ethnic unity, one could see that when the party experienced this difficulty, that those who followed Burnham and those who followed Jagan did not follow them on the basis of race. They obviously followed them on the basis of ideology, and so you can see a Guyana following Jagan, and you can see a Singh following Burnham. Clearly, ideologically, they were divided, and that is what, in a sense, led to the split in the party and led to the divide in the movement, which was then struggling for independence.
That's a very key point, because a lot of people think that the split has always been racial, and I don't think a lot of people even think back to the point when the isms were that critical, where all young men were basically socialist, communist, capitalist, or some other ist. And but it's very important that we emphasize that point, that the split, and this is how we see the races splitting based on ideology and not based on just a racial.
Well, it's slightly complex from this perspective, that the party was not composed of the masses, all of the masses. The party would have had a certain cadre within its ranks. We recognize that even as the party pursued an ideological persuasion, that it was recognized the need for ethnic unity. And that is what brought Burnham and Jagan together. And so even as they went apart on the basis of ideology, in terms of the organic difference, the nation went apart in terms of the African Guyanese in the main, apart from the leadership, who could be considered to be the conscious, ideological minded people. The African Guyanese at large following Forbes Burnham, and the Indo-Guyanese at large following Chetty Jagan. And I think it would be correct to say that the leaders recognize that as well. And so, notwithstanding their own ideological persuasions, may have also pandered to those groups based on ethnicity. So one can argue that yes, the split, you can't nail Burnham down in relation to the split, saying that he merely sought power, because that is the accusation, that Burnham wanted to have power and therefore at all costs. Clearly one sees that the split was ideological, and therefore Burnham's difference and reason for whatever he did was ideological. But having had the ideological split in the party, in terms of the nation, the same way in which Burnham and Jagan were brought together for ethnic unity, as the same way in which their going apart led to African Guyanese largely following Burnham and Indo-Guyanese largely following Jagan, and therefore in the broad mass nationalist movement occurred that fracturing. And as I was saying, I think that it would be fair to say that the leaders were conscious of that difference, and that for their own survival they would have to turn and find ways to relate to their natural constituencies. And I think that is where the politics became, in a sense, oriented towards ethnicity, and to some extent started to downplay the ideological difference, but the real initial problem, the primary problem, would have been the ideological problem.
Now, was there a difference, Vincent, between the rural communities in terms of the way they looked at the impact of race and the urban community?
But that's another interesting point. It's another interesting point because in terms of the demography of the country, it reflected the ethnic divide.
Meaning?
By the time we got to the 50s and the early 60s, to a large extent, based on how Guyanese arrived and how they settled, we were in different physical places. So we had, in the main, the Amerindians were in the hinterland, so they were in a sense their own territory. We had the Europeans largely being absentee, and when they were present they were on the estates to a large extent. We had the Chinese and the Africans who had arrived after the Europeans, living in villages that they had purchased to a large extent. And we also had African migration into the urban centers, into certain kinds of occupations, the civil service, the police and things like that. So that you had the Africans in villages on one hand, and also in the urban centers, essentially Georgetown and New Amsterdam. And you also had Africans in the Linden area, which at that time would not have been quite an urban center, but because they have gone to work in industry, with some Africans as well in the hinterland, in the gold and diamond industry. And you had the Indians largely now on the estates, and in areas adjacent to the estates that were called extra-nuclear areas. Extra-nuclear areas. So you had a demography that saw a divide in terms of the communities that were established. You had clearly some communities which were Indian communities, clearly some communities which were African communities, clearly the Amerindians. Also the Chinese and Portuguese would have come to the urban centers. So they were also large in the urban centers. There were some instances of mixed communities, but by and large you had this great divide taking place in terms of settlement of the different ethnic groups, and therefore in that regard also developing different interests. Different interests because Indo-Guyanese would have been associated with sugar to a large extent, and a physical space associated with sugar. African Guyanese would have been associated with resistance to sugar, and the physical space that represented from where they resisted. African Guyanese would have been associated with acts of elevation into the public sector, the public service, more than Indo-Guyanese, and again associated with that space and the interest of that space. Chinese and Portuguese would have been more into commerce, the merchants, and in that sense representing some kind of space as well. So there were clear definitions, and these definitions started to take other forms. So for example, the Indo-Guyanese were able to retain their religious persuasion, and in where they were able to establish their temples to a large extent. The African Guyanese in their villages moved in the direction of Christianity. There were those who also continued with the Orthodox religion of Africa, and that was located in their villages. The Portuguese, to a very large extent, in the urban centers took to the Catholic religion. So you can see, even in terms of the superstructure of the society, the institutions of the society took on ethnic dimensions. The religion taking on a particular dimension in particular, and religion being a very strong one. And this penetrated into other things like even the school system. So for example, we know that the churches were involved in schools. And so the schools were Catholic schools or Anglican schools, and of course eventually there were some government schools. So what we saw happening in a sense was a struggle taking place between the ethnic groups. And so for example, if somebody of an Indian origin wanted to go to a school that was Catholic or Anglican, that person had to adopt a Christian name, an English name. supposed to be able to identify with the school, which really was more disposed to people of those religious groups. So here we have another institution, in a sense, perpetrating the divide on one hand, or acting as an instrument of subjugation on the other hand, so that the ethnic divide was really taking root, though one may not have discerned aggression between the groups until we got to the early 60s and mid 60s, when the political parties called upon their constituencies in the face of a struggle for power, in the face of a difference of policy. The parties called on the constituencies, and therefore we clearly went into an era of ethnic strife, where, based on the differences of policies and the nature of the struggle, we saw the groups were now at each other, and in particular the Afro-Guyanese and the Ng-A-Qui.
So from around coming into the 60s, the 64.
Well, the extent to which the parties split and they followed their leaders, it laid the base. But the actual strife in terms of physical interaction is more associated with the early 60s and beyond the 60s. In the 50s, yes, at election time one could see the differences and things like that, but with issues, economic issues, issues with policies of the government, issues of the way in which the strike weapon was used and things like that, all of these things took an ethnic divide. Because, for example, you would find that the People's National Congress and the UF were able to command the support of the urban centers, and so they could use the civil service as an active part of their struggle. And the Indo-Guyanese in the sugar industry, on the other hand, were supporting the PPP, and so it became different, in a sense, different sectors of the society struggling against each other, and the contours were racial contours.
Okay. So we're now into the UF PNC era.
Yes, we're into
where
the
you have now, and that was how did that come about? I mean, what was the basis for that joining?
Well, ethnicity started to manifest itself in various ways, and one of the ways in which it manifested itself is the way in which the electoral system facilitated PPP victory from 1957 onwards, right through to 1961, in the circumstance where they were not commanding the majority of the voters.
Meaning, explain that.
We had a situation where we had the first past the post system, and the PPP would win most of the constituencies.
What is first past the post system?
It's a system where the country is divided into constituencies. Of course, those constituencies all represent equal numbers of people. And the party that wins the majority of constituencies wins the legislature. So that in each constituency, the candidate with the largest number of votes was the one who would go into the legislature. So when you looked at the overall permutation, you would find a situation where the PPP very often got in the 40s in terms of their percentage of votes, but because of the constituency system, ended up with 60% of the seats. So that a party that may have won the plurality, but certainly not the majority, was able to maintain itself in government. And given the issues that were arising and the ethnic differences that existed and the ethnic clashes that occurred, whether they be clashes of interest or subsequently real physical clashes, there seemed to be a feel that the PPP, and by virtue of the PPP, the Indo-Guyanese would continue to be the dominant sector in politics at the expense of a majority of people because they were not commanding a majority. And so this led to the call for a more equitable,
which is the proportional representation
electoral system, which was proportional representation. And we see that this became a major issue with the PPP resisting and the PNC in fact proposing and supported by the UF even before we got to 64, the idea of proportional representation, and this became a major issue with the constitutional talks that were held with the British for the realization of independence and constitutional reform, to the point that there was a deadlock in the talks, a deadlock where they could not agree on the electoral system, and to break that deadlock, Teddy Jagan suggested that Duncan Sands be given the prerogative to determine the electoral system. And I think we need to note that too.
Duncan Sands was at the time the Secretary.
He was the British Colonial Secretary.
Right.
And he was given, at the initiative of Teddy Jagan, the prerogative of coming up with a system. Burnham was reluctant in the first instance, but subsequently agreed. And so Sands had this responsibility. And Sands came up with PR, proportional representation, as the electoral system. Now, there's some things to observe here. One, proportional representation meant that whichever party got the highest proportion of the votes using the country as one constituency rather than a number of constituencies would be the party that would be in government. So it changed from a system where a party could win a minority and be in government to a system where a party has to definitely be the majority party or the party of plurality to be in government. And
this is the PR system.
So we came to the PR system in 1964. What is of interest, and another period of ethnic strife, was that having given Sands that responsibility, when Sands pronounced, Teddy came back to Guyana and apparently under pressure from his party started a campaign against PR. And so we went through another period of ethnic problems in the country with Teddy campaigning against PR. And in fact the PPP from then to now arguing it was a conspiracy to get Chedi out of government.
In fact, Chedi was the one that suggested to Duncan Sands to make the call, and then he pronounced it.
And the fact of the matter is that notwithstanding all of the information about the American involvement and the British involvement, obviously based on the Cold War and ideological reasons, there's some things to note. One, that none of what happened between 61 and 64 impact on the nature of the vote. The voting was an equal ethnic census, 61, 64, an equal ethnic census. So no matter what you say about what the British did or what the Americans did, they did not impact. In fact, there's evidence to show that in 64, the number of votes for the PPP in fact increased. So from all of this trauma that we had, the party that seemed to have benefited in terms of votes was the PPP, but they did not benefit in terms of what the system produced, because by then the system provided for
a majority
government, and the system clearly provided for something which was normal then and is normal now, for parties after an election to come together to form a majority and therefore to form the government. And that's exactly what the governor did. The governor called on the PNC and the UF to form the government. It is true to say that at that time Jagan did propose that he could form a government with the PNC. But I think that one has to recognize that it wasn't a very prudent thing for the PNC to do, for the simple reason that one of the reasons the PPP themselves argued that Guyana was being denied its independence was because of the association of Guyana with the East.
With the East.
The objective of the country then was independence. Why do you go into a coalition with the PPP, which seems to have been the obstacle to independence, when the objective is independence? So the PNC at that time, I think quite prudently and quite nationalistically, went into a coalition with the UF that saw us going to independence in 1966. But going to independence with the PPP complaining that they had been cheated out of government. In fact, when the elections results were declared in 1964 and the governor indicated that he was going to appoint the PNC in the US as government, the PPP refused to leave office and had to be taken out of office by an order of the government. So we have a history here of the PPP not accepting the results that are embedded in a system of which they were a part. Embedded in the laws of Guyana, there was nothing illegal about that. It was clearly what the laws provided for, but they refused and claimed it was some conspiracy. One may agree that the Americans did have favor, the British did have favor, but there's little evidence to show that it's their favor that one led to the way in which the votes were cast, and two, that the votes were cast in favor of the PPP in terms of them getting all of the ethnic votes they got previously, and so they lost nothing, and three, that the system did provide for the majority to form a government, which is in fact what eventually happened.
Okay, so we've gotten to now, that brings us very clearly, I think, to independence.
Independence.
So we now have the golden arrowhead, and now we have to get the local isms now, to get the races back in some sort of a system where they can work for a national agenda.
Well,
talk a little bit about the politics of race and the national agenda and how
the first problem with independence was that we saw coming out of what happened in 64, Jagan did not participate in all of the independence talks. So to a large extent, the matter of independence was settled with Burnham and the Caribbeans being the ones participating in the talks. Now that for me is interesting, because whilst one has to agree that Jagan was involved in the independence struggle starting from the 40s, it was not under his astute leadership that we eventually got independence. It was under the astute leadership of Burnham, who recognized what was the prudent thing to do in 64, who continued in the process until 66, that in fact we got independence. So this whole question of who really led us to independence,
who's the father of the
who's
nation,
the father of the nation, I think is determined at this point. At independence, there was a show of unity in some regards. Jagan came to the ceremony, he embraced Burnham, but it is said that at the same time, at the grassroots level, the people of the PPP were not encouraged to participate in that moment. While Jagan participated on the stage there, at the roots level, he did not participate. So we had a situation where we went into independence with the PPP in some regards in full opposition. In full opposition, with the PNC and UF together. And that has all sorts of configurations associated with it. Remember we talked earlier on about the Indo-Guyanese being largely rural, and the African-Guyanese being in villages rural, but also in the urban centers. We talked about the Portuguese being urban, and the Gyar to a large extent garnered his votes from the urban centers and from the Amerindians. So that you see, even in the independence movement, some geographic kind of representation and geographic exclusion based on the way in which the parties approach the question of independence. Now, for the period 1966 on to the period 1968, with the coalition between Burnham and the Gyar, to a large extent, the logical question dominated, because they clearly followed the policy that was capitalist oriented.
1966 to 1968.
Undoubtedly followed the policy. Early period after independence, and the period of PNC and the UF. By 68, they went their separate paths, but one could well argue that beyond 68, that there was a continuation along the capitalist path, with the country experiencing a fair amount of economic growth and development. And that's an important point to note, because we have this habit of these days of just speaking about 28 years and not recognizing the various eras.
Yeah, well, this is why you're here.
And we did have the era of, I would say, from 66 to the early 70s, when the country pursued the path of capitalist development, when there was evidence of economic growth and economic development taking place. But at the same time, when there was the evidence of the commencement of the process of economic sabotage, because the PPP never embraced the national government. During that period, they started the process of economic sabotage. A large part of the struggle was based on the sugar industry and their struggle for what they considered to be betterment for the sugar workers, the establishment of a union that was essentially a union of the PPP in the sugar industry that fought against the MPCA, which was a pro-capitalist union. So you have this continuous thing going on between ethnicity on one hand and ideology on the other hand. Richard Ismail was of the TUF, the UF at that time, so he represented a constituency other than the Indian constituency in terms of the politics, but certainly represented the Indian constituency in terms of labor, because the MPCA was then the main union. It was then described as a union, a company union, a union that was there to cooperate with the sugar company, rather than a union that was there to represent the interests of the people at large. But to backtrack a bit, even in that regard, one should make a note of the way in which leftist policy of Jagan affected his vision, because the records now show that Jock Campbell, Sir Jock Campbell, who was the inheritor of Booker's, the Booker's estate, was disposed to a more paternalistic approach to the sugar industry that would have seen a number of things being done that were in the workers' interest, but Jagan simply did not take him on board and resisted all that Jock Campbell proposed to do. And one should refer to Ciceran's bittersweet sugar to see what is being said in this regard, where ideology again came up as a block to what could have been a more progressive sugar industry even under the Jagan regime. So we get to the early 70s, and by then the PPP is, by then the TUF is out of government, it's the PNC alone, and we see a gradual shift now where Burnham takes on that cloak of being leftist, not far left, but certainly nationalistic left, and spouting a brand of socialism that was supposed to be indigenous, something that was happening not only in Guyana. We saw this happening in Africa to a very large extent. We even saw the Congress Party in India spouting some degree of socialism as well. So this was not something that was peculiar to Guyana, but it certainly the peculiarity was the use of the cooperative as the vehicle, and the enunciating of cooperativism as the ideology. And I think that was a largely misunderstood ideology. Burnham never meant that the cooperativism to be centered around the institution called the cooperative alone. He meant that the institution called the cooperative would be a pivotal institution, but that cooperativism would really be a philosophy and ideology of cooperation in a trisectoral economy. And so there was a way was to be found for the state, the co-op sector and the private sector to cooperate, and for the philosophy of conduct of business of the country to be cooperativism, so that the communities would take on an element of cooperative endeavor at whichever level. And that is what cooperativism really meant. It didn't simply mean the form of cooperative and to have a proliferation of cooperatives, and that would be cooperativism. It was more than that. It was a philosophy of engagement among people that
involved state, private sector, and
the cooperatives. And outside of the economy, for the people themselves, in the community, to cooperate to do things at the community level, and to have cooperation across communities, so that in a sense also was intended to address the ethnic divide. Because the argument was that cooperativism reflected in some regards what the African Guyanese did when they were freed in the villages, but it also was intended to reflect what the Indo-Guyanese were doing, bringing the Indian system of the patriarchs, I think it was, into the local arrangement in the extranuclear areas. And so there was an attempt here to reflect an ethos that was a Guyanese ethos based on ancestry, in a sense. One would have to accept, however, that this may more have been skewed towards the African Guyanese ancestry than the other ancestries, and may have been seen as some kind of domination and imposition of what was essentially an African Guyanese ideology on the rest of the country. And so, given all the problems before, this in itself became a problem, because the PPP continued to talk hard Marxism, saw cooperativism as reactionary, not progressive, and so did not support cooperativism. In fact, their support only came in the mid-70s, when we moved to the point of nationalization, something which was in keeping with what they were asking for. In fact, one should know that Burnham did not start off by advocating nationalization. Burnham started off by advocating control of the commanding heights of the economy. And his intent really was to have a majority share in the foreign corporations, transnationals, so as to control the commanding heights. But the transnationals were not did not acquiesce to his requests for commanding heights, control of the commanding heights, and so he was left with no alternative in this circumstance but to nationalize. But in nationalizing, he then got the support of the People's Progressive Party, because that was in keeping with their Marxist orientation, and their view that the working class, the state, the working class through the state, should in fact own and control the economic resources of the country. So we see some degree of convergence taking place in the 70s, with Werner moving more left in this instance because of circumstances, more than because of his own policy and conviction.
Okay, so that's when the country took on the name, the Cooperative
Republic. It's indeed in 1970 that the country became a republic, and adopted the name of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. So we saw the ideological shift from the pro-capitalist approach at that time to a more leftist and progressive approach. So we have the 70s, and I think in this circumstance we also have to look at what was happening in terms of Guyana's external affairs. Because Guyana's external affairs became very critical in terms of future developments. Burnham had always supported a progressive foreign policy. He was a beneficiary of the national liberation movement that was taking place across the globe, the independence movement, so to speak, and therefore in terms of his foreign policy was supportive of decolonization, and proceeded to represent that in his foreign policy, in addition to his position that since he was not of the East, nor of the West. He would follow a policy of non-alignment.
Okay. And this is where his involvement in the non-alignment movement internationally came about.
He became, in third world terms, a progressive leader, non-aligned. Non-alignment was different to what the Swedish did. They were neutral, they were distant, equidistant from East and West. Non-alignment meant that you would judge things based on their worth. And so there were times you could collaborate with the East, there were times you could collaborate with the West, but you had no fixed position on the East nor on the West. And so we saw that had its impact because the progressive countries, including the East, could no longer simply support Jagan and his contentions, because here was a Burnham who was now manifesting progressive policies internationally, having manifest in collaboration with PPP's progressive policies internally as well, in the face of the communist world. And so in some regards Jagan was now forced to move in the direction of what he called critical support. Critical support. And so we had critical support in the mid-70s, largely centered around the question of nationalization and foreign policy. And we also saw critical support in relation to our border controversy. And so the PPP, in a sense, in principle, supported issues like the People's Militia and things like that as a Guyanese approach to a burning border controversy which was threatening much of the existence of Guyana.
Okay, so now we are in the mid-70s, and we are fully established as the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. We have races, all sectors basically involved in a capitalist, socialist experiment, if you will. During that time, I recall a lot of new industries sprung up in rural areas. In a lot of fish, for example, the salt fish is an outstanding one.
Well, there was a fundamental policy of
talk to all of that, so that we get a context.
There's a fundamental policy of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, which were pursued in the context of cooperativism. Self-sufficiency on one hand meaning that we would seek as far as possible to produce the goods and services that we consume and to make us less reliable on imports. And there was a reason for that. It was a question of how does one garner the foreign currency to involve in capital investment rather than using your foreign currency for consumption. And so self-reliance was one of the ways in which he sought to pursue that. Self-sufficiency, Self-reliance, on the other hand, was the attempt to build an economy that was integrated. Integrated, so you weren't primarily going to be involved in the production of primary goods for export, but you were going to try to link your primary goods with secondary goods so that you create a greater independence of your economy. You see, when you produce only primary goods and you have to sell them in a market that is very, very hostile, then from time to time you have all sorts of problems with your prices and you're realizing your value. And so the thing to do is to produce secondary goods, the markets for which are often far more stable. On one hand, it will reduce the level of importation you have to be engaged in. On the other hand, it will give you goods that can sustain their price, and therefore it lends to economic sustainability. And so those were two of the major prongs that Burnham engaged in: self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency in relation to housing, clothing, and feeding oneself, and self-reliance in terms of trying to have industrial development so that your primary goods could have value added and you produce secondary goods, and have an economy that had forward and backward internal linkages, rather than an economy that was merely linked to external sources, and therefore whatever happened in the international economy would affect you. And we saw that happening in the 70s with the oil crisis. We were heavily dependent on oil, and once the oil price shot up, we were caught, and caught because some mistakes were made.
But let me interrupt for a second, because we are running out of time here. It's obvious that we're going to have a third session, because we are only now getting into in the 1970s. We still have to go through to where we are now.
Well, if we're wrapping up, let's
so I'd like you to just give us a closing thought. So
let's say this in wrapping up, that we're addressing the ethnic question in all of this. And we're at a point where we're saying in government is a dominant African party. And from the very inception of that party in government, there were problems of cooperation, support and collaboration from the PPP, which was a dominant Indian party. So that for a great part of this period, that fractured situation pertained. It never really ended, except that for international pressures, and because of some adoption of the policies of the PPP that they would have supported, in the latter part of the 70s, we saw some collaboration in the form of critical support. What is important to note also is that in the period of the 70s, the early 70s and the mid-70s, there were two attempts at a national unity government, with the PPP and the PNC being involved in those talks. And that in the mid-70s, the talks went the full distance, with all of the issues being resolved. In fact, it is said that the very last issue to be resolved was the question of national service. PPP objected to national service for females. And there were all sorts of claims about national service and females. And at the last meeting, Burnham said that matter had been resolved. And he said to Cheney that he was prepared to make national service completely voluntary in any circumstance for females. And so the question of compelling females would no longer exist. There was no other issue to be resolved. But Janet Jagan let her walk out of those on the grounds that she wasn't quite sure she could trust Burnham. And therefore those talks should come to an end. One point I want to make on the national service is all of the hullabaloo over national service. The only component of national service that was compulsory was for university students. There were thousands of Guyanese who went to national service of their own volition. It was not for them compulsory. And those thousands included people like Jerry Govayo and Peter Ramsey.
And on that note, we will adjourn until we have a session 3, and I think another session on this is warranted. So this is your edition of African Drums. Until next time, I'm Ng-A-Qui.